He wants to find the truths about being human, how multiple aspects of sensations, thought, imagination, and memory constitute a fairly stable self. He situates that sense of personhood in the shared aspects of being alive, woven into a sensitive milieu. Nighttime is given to us as a common but shadowy aspect, where the senses of touch and scent and sound trump sight, and when things and events are more ambiguous than in daytime experience. Yet I also claim that In Search of Lost Time is not simply covert philosophy. It is rich, multi-layered, deliberately written literature, and within its borders, we feel ourselves to be more human, more alive, imaginations activated, and memories restored. Like the unreliable narrator, we are the ones who are lost. We are the obscure country. This novel is like a paper pattern for a dress we fit to our own dimensions. By following Proust's detailed descriptions of very particular places and times, we may see similarities to the ways in which we experience the world. In this, we can say that we not only discover our own paths, we create them. A parenthetical remark. The first-person narrator shares a personal name with the author, Marcel Proust. Nowhere in Swann's Way does his given name appear, so when I call the protagonist Marcel, it is with foresight into later volumes where it is suggested that his name might be like the author, Marcel Proust. We should not conflate the author and narrator, however irresistible the temptation. It is often difficult to tell how old the protagonist is, or when the narrating voice slips from middle-age retrospection to you are there flashbacks. Tonight I will refer only to Volume 1, Swann's Way, and the final volume, Finding Time Again, Volume 7. The world appears and is traversed differently at night. We will examine the alterations in spatial comprehension that Proust describes. My main question is this: can we say, on the basis of significant differences in lived spatiality between day and night, that the obscure country of the human is also sought and found in analogously distinct ways? In Volume 1, Swann's Way, the only happy event our narrator remembers from early childhood occurs as an after-dinner walk when the family is lost and the father finds the back gate. If indeed the insomniac narrator, middle-aged seeker of lost time, locates this happy moment as his own key to reconstitute vanished worlds, we would do well to analyze the episode in detail. We often think about time with the aid of this novel, and granted that time and space are intimately connected, let's focus tonight on lived spatiality. A prelude-like piece sets Marcel Proust's novel in motion. This chapter, titled Cambrai 1, situates life-altering trauma at bedtime without the young boy's parents. The highlight of the chapter is the famous episode of the Madeleine cake dipped in tea, an involuntary memory that brings with it a more comprehensive recollection of early childhood for the adult narrator. Then Proust begins the novel a second time. Cambrai Chapter 2 offers us the evening walk we will analyze tonight. We will follow this short, though meandering passage to open up major Proustian themes. On your handout, I have numbered sections that directly follow one another in the text. We begin mid-paragraph. There is an indent right before number 5. I've introduced these numbers to enable us to examine each sentence separately, yet to maintain the sequence of the sentences. Like a little child ends the section marked by asterisks in the American edition and with an extra line space in the French. Proust begins this episode, 1. If there was moonlight and the air was warm, instead of having us go home directly, my father, out of a love of personal glory, would take us by way of the Calvary on a long walk, which my mother's little capacity for orienting herself or knowing what road she was on made her consider the feat that of a strategic genius. What happens to the world at night? Loss of the habitual markers of place and direction requires active attention and sensitive response. There is a stumbling or ambivalent quality to the gestures humans make along a nighttime walk, here demonstrated by both mother and boy who identifies with her. They walk par le calvaire, by the Calvary, a traditional memorial of Jesus' place of crucifixion. He too walked this path, and the family unthinkingly repeats his suffering journey. Since medieval times in northern France, these wooden or stone wayside altars have acted both as objects of veneration and navigation devices at crossroads. They claim the landscape for Christianity, as does the church with its orienting steeple. Young Marcel tells seasonal time by the colors of the sky reflected in the pool at the foot of the sculptured Calvary, sunset red during the winter when days end early, and opal or moonlit by later summer walks. During the daytime, the village Cambrai shows itself to be built by accretion, stone by stone, houses clustered together with shared walls. Yet our protagonist distinguishes the sacred from the secular when he describes the facade of the church, Saint-Hilaire, and its domestic neighbors. Flowers from the nearby window ledge may creep over to the church territory, yet do not touch its holy wall. There is something inviolate about sacred space according to the child's view, and the fact that a Calvary may have orienting functions as well as ritualistic ones does not reduce it to the practical world. Places have different qualities and are not interchangeable. The child does not live in a Cartesian world where both space and time are homogeneous. His spatial and temporal reality is an organic one, which is significantly altered at night. Where and when you measure experience matters, and by implication, who is at the heart of experience may alter as well. Young Marcel distinguishes the two ways, the Méséglise way by Swann's home and the Guermantes way. These walks are so separate in his experience that they must begin from different gates in Aunt Léonie's yard. The Guermantes way establishes the ideal river walk, while the way chez Swann exudes the ideal essence of a plain. Our narrator is an adult before he can constitute an integrated, coherent map of the region in his mind. As a child, Marcel is sensitive to the qualitative features of the two ways and thus experiences a discontinuous spatial world. He knows where he is by distinct vegetation and the foot feel of the paths themselves spooling out from the fixed center, his Aunt Léonie. She has a more circumscribed path from her bed to her sitting room, and she suffers from a nightmare that her deceased husband will make her take a walk outside. Regardless of her hypochondriacal reasons, Marcel will always find her at home, and this centers his experience of the village of Cambrai. About town, the day-lit church steeple orients the lad, seen in part rising above a building or reappearing at the end of another short street. The church steeple is a pivot point for the accumulation of aspectual views. Together, these partial views constitute an ensemble, Cambrai. By day, the way home is directly related to one's position relative to the church steeple. The church itself has a religious purpose and is marked out as a separate spatial zone, yet it serves this orienting function. The child's bedroom opens onto a limited view of the church tower's base, by whose black slates he can tell time of day, weather, and disposition of the town's inhabitants. Much like Aunt Léonie, who claims there's not even a dog whom one does not know, young Marcel is precisely and thoroughly familiar with his surroundings. Natural rhythms of sunlight and shadow over the course of the day and seasons contribute to his ability to interpret the black slates and the likely habitual activities of Combray's inhabitants. The child is constantly accompanied by the church as a living being, quote, without equivalent, but the adult narrator seeks it no longer in space, but, as he says, in his heart. The parish priest boasts of the grand panorama that can be seen from the steeple itself. It exhausts Aunt Leonie to even imagine the landscape spread out before her, to see it, the panorama, with a magical glance, and to come away enchanté. The evocation of magic is a demotion of the sacred, and is an effect of the human eye poised where none but birds and gods should be. Yet the priest has to admit that his usual partial views, though now caught in one great net, still lack something. He says, "But you can't see any water. It's as though there were deep clefts dividing the town into different neighborhoods so neatly it looks like a brioche still holding together after it's been sliced. To do it right, you'd have to be in both places at the same time, in the steeple of Saint-Hilaire and at Jouet-le-Vicomte. Being in two places at once, with the high altitude sight lines of a god, might bind the sliced loaf of bread, the brioche. Yet this is an inhuman hope, one that is outside concrete experience. Blocked by buildings and natural objects such as hills, streams, and trees, human views are necessarily partial and discontinuous. The cosmos as brioche is confirmed by walking, by handling with embodied movements, portions that do not appear to the eye alone. An evening walk is particularly social and lacks the direct motivations of shopping, errands, or urgent destinations. A twilight promenade is made to feel the evening air, to either work up an appetite or digest one's food, and to enjoy each other's company at a relaxed pace. Yet surprisingly, the mother loses her sense of direction. How can this be when the town is so familiar, as are the neighboring paths and fields? We must consider the effects of moonlight to transform and distort what is clear in the daytime. Fairy tales and myths remind us of the dreamy suspension of daylight order, and here we see both son and mother susceptible to this. The night, albeit warm and moonlit, changes the world into an exotic and magical dark place. The shadows have their own shadows, and it would require a walker of strategic genius to interpret the world's signs. Initially, the village Cambrai represents the outer limit of the world. Anxiety associated with the critical moment of arrival from their Paris apartment governs the young child. He worries he will miss the stop, and he feels stress related to paying attention to that which adults find important, rather than to the sensuous variety passing the train's window. He recalls this in the middle of relating the evening walk episode. 2. Sometimes we would go as far as the viaduct, whose giant strides of stone began at the railway station and represented to me the exile and distress that lay outside the civilized world. Because each year as we came from Paris, we were warned to pay careful attention when Cambrai came, not to let the station go by, to be ready ahead of time, because the train would leave again after 2 minutes and would set off across the viaduct beyond the Christian countries of which Cambrai marked for me the farthest limit. Thoughts of exile and distress and the giant strides compared with which the small boy's legs are lacking in power return our minds to the bedtime trauma in Cambrai 1. Then, cast out from the warm circle of adults talking around the dinner table in the garden, the anxious child hovered on the landing at the top of the stairs in despair of another goodnight kiss. Willing to face the unpredictable anger of his father, who mounts the stairs projecting a monstrous shadow before him, the lad braces himself for exile or death at his hands. He is at his father's mercy, powerless either to defend himself or give over his need for maternal comfort. Somehow Marcel cannot imagine life either without the kiss or beyond the environs of the village. A small group of particular places formed first of the holiday walks in Cambrai, the neighborhoods near their Paris apartment, and the vacation destination of Baalbek constitute most of the daylight terrain of the 7-volume In Search of Lost Time. Through the agency of names, the wider world gradually attains some correlation between experienced places and map-like coordinates. As an adolescent, our narrator will become fascinated with train timetables, calling out in order memorized lists of place names. Just the sequence of names measured in distance by the printed times between train stops is enough to sustain Marcel's vision of a place called Venice, for example. These imagined places are abstract, belonging neither to day nor to night. The recalling of the viaduct, a suggestion of Roman or other ancient civilizations, and distress in handling modern technologies, such as trains, interrupts our narrator's description of the more pastoral event, an evening walk with solid footing on a habitual path with his father as guide. It is interesting to note that even this episode was forgotten in the harsh light of the bedtime trauma described so poignantly in Cambrai 1. It is not until after the 20-something narrator tastes the famous lime blossom tea and madeleine cake that the dried paper flower-like Cambrai blooms into a lively village. Marcel begins to reclaim the lost happy time of early childhood. Nonetheless, the much older narrator continues to cultivate or to suffer from insomnia as he recounts his childhood apprehension of the world. Thus, Cambrai 1 remains always located at bedtime and fixed on the varnished wooden stairs leading to the dreaded evening alone, sleepless in bed. Candle-cast shadows make distorted monsters appear along this way. Marcel's later efforts to contain his terror and dread through abstract ordering methods such as timetables and maps are insufficient to manage his feelings and change his story. Instead, abstraction closes down the felt sense of particular places. The narrator allows us to accompany young Marcel in his digressive experiences of the world unfolding, so at first we do not have a methodic understanding of the world of Cambrai. We are not in a position to sort through the entanglements of impressions gained on country walks and the imaginative supplements of the place names. We must undergo the experience of being lost, even if a moonlit walk or the act of reading can also be pleasurable. Our younger narrator describes the moonlit world as akin to an unfolded map with ridges and bends that give him an expanded sense of the terrain. In the middle of relating the bedtime trauma episode in Cambrai 1, the narrator takes time to notice the world outside his window, holding its breath much like the child himself, still waiting for Mama to come upstairs to kiss him goodnight. He observes, "Outdoors, too, things seemed frozen in silent attention, so as not to disturb the moonlight, which, duplicating and distancing each thing by extending its shadow before it, denser and more concrete than itself, had at once thinned and enlarged the landscape like a map that had been folded and was now opened out. What needed to move, a few leaves of the chestnut tree, moved. But their minute quivering, complete, executed even in its slightest nuances and ultimate refinements, did not spill over to the rest, did not merge with it, remained circumscribed." Moonlight here articulates the physical world in a way that contrasts with sunlight. Shadows are denser than the day-lit, thinner versions of their host objects and than the objects themselves. The active party is the moonlight, busily duplicating and separating things. The trees respond quietly and subtly, giving an overall painterly effect. The boy's bedroom window frames the view tightly. Notice, too, that the stories are framed within stories. Episodes trigger each other in a spatially nested arrangement as Cambrai moves from 2 into 3 dimensions. In Cambrai chapter 2, when he's out walking at night with his parents, the effect of moonlight is elaborated. This is number 3. We would return by way of the Station Boulevard, which was lined by the most pleasant houses in the parish. In each garden, the moonlight, like Hubert Robert, scattered its broken staircases of white marble, its fountains, its half-open gates. Its light had destroyed the telegraph office. All that remained was one column, half shattered, but still retaining the beauty of an immortal ruin. I would be dragging my feet. I would be ready to drop with sleep. The fragrance of the lindens that perfumed the air would seem to me a reward that one could win only at the cost of the greatest fatigue, and that was not worth the trouble. The circle begins to close as the family heads homeward by way of the railway station boulevard. The child senses this direction, perhaps in part by his weariness. Yet the gardens they pass remind him of paintings by Hubert Robert, noted for moonlit, fantastical landscapes of ruins. Several of Robert's pre-Romantic paintings reside in the Louvre Museum in Paris, showing ancient Rome by night, or as a prospective example, the Louvre itself as a ruin. Robert's imagination ran in 2 directions, towards the juxtaposition of past places conceived as meeting in one, as in his painting The Arc de Triomphe and the Theatre of Orange, that's in the Louvre. In the forward direction, he painted visions of the ultimate destiny of all building as ruins. In both cases, the disjunctive assemblage of chunks of marble and half-open gates invites the viewer's participation in combining the broken pieces. Here the child notices the jagged stairs that don't have to be climbed in a separation from his mother, fountains and gates, which could be openings to home terrain. Shadows deepen and swallow the Roman columns and formal features of public buildings, dissolving the sharp edges and curves structured by day. The night itself envelops buildings that must be felt or remembered to fill in their transitory broken state. And while the description of destruction, shattering, and scattering is sharp and negative, these verbs do their work among the most pleasant houses in town. Walls and fences no longer close off private property or define public spaces. Natural changes do not frame the world for the boy dragging his tired self through the landscape as a golden frame around a painting in a museum would do. Yet the night softens and limits distances. The moonlight acts as an artist, effacing the quotidian world. At night, the telegraph office is closed, so nobody taps out coded messages to lands far beyond the civilized Cambrai. Yet in its dramatic alteration by moonlight, the building attains immortality. What kind of immortality is conferred upon a half-lit column whose remainder will be restored in the morning? Nostalgia for past times or regained times is not in play here for 2 reasons. First, the changes are natural rather than caused by human violence, which will turn the Way Chez Swann into a World War I battlefield by the end of the novel. Moonlight continually works its magic, indifferent to history. Second, the narrative voice shifts here to the child's perspective in relating this event, which occurred often enough to be habitual. Sometimes they returned home from one direction, sometimes from another, yet these evening walks take on ritual significance. Though forgotten until Cambrai II, these features of family life in the dark are still there for the boy, just as the invisible portion of the column remains in the shadows. The way in which they exist relies as much on the imagination as the memory of the experiencing consciousness. The child can smell le parfum, the perfume of lindens he cannot see, and he will not bump into them as a result of imagining their shape and location. Thus, in the present, imagination works alongside moonlight to make the nighttime world whole. As we move through it, confirmation of latent features is possible by activating senses other than sight. The adult narrator distinguishes events that are, quote, deep layers of my mental soil as the firm ground on which I still stand, end quote. The child has not yet left that ground, which allows the sacred and the mundane to coexist without contradiction. Imagining the links between broken pieces as one would restore an architectural ruin might situate the narrator as a Viollet-le-Duc, the architect who intended to restore the medieval layer under the more recent accretions of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, for example. To get back to the original look of things turns out to be impossible, both in life and in art restoration. Hubert Robert, by contrast, openly imagines buildings from disparate ages, cheek by jowl in a vaguely olden days milieu. Which is more real, the scent of the unseen linden tree blossoms as the boy walks by, or the look of the dried flowers in the teacup? It is too fatiguing to divide the world this way, for lindens yield lime blossoms for tea, which turn out to be the catalyst for Marcel's life-changing recollection. The nighttime walk episode now reads as a shadow of the shocking bedtime event that previously blocked its ruined half-light. The fragrance, le parfum, of both scent and taste of lime blossom governs the involuntary memory experience of the Madeleine. That memory connects the boy with Aunt Leonie, the bedridden invalid, but it also links him to the self who went for walks at nighttime. His insight comes in late afternoon on a weary winter day, when as a young adult he is reluctant to take the tea his mother offers. Shadows are least able to show themselves in that dull, gray Parisian twilight. He had concluded that it's a waste of effort to try to intellectually reclaim the past when a chance taste of lime blossom tea makes a sacramental opening to the fuller memories of an immortal Cambrai, distinguished here as Chapter 2. Involuntary memories of events seemingly lost forever return unbidden. Like a bottle of scent that has been sealed for a long time, these memories have been untouched by intervening time and experiences. By day, they must wrestle for space with the present. One of them must win, or the rememberer will go mad. Yet shadows by night are dense with half-recollected, half-imagined associations that enrich the environment. I focus here on the recollected events that can affect the rememberer because of their continuity, their latent connections with the body. These shadows are different from the shadows that reach out into the world from our feet, growing and shrinking as the day affects them. Projections cast on bedroom walls and furniture stem from artificial light by candles or magic lanterns. The moon's light is itself indirect, taking the bodies of both the sun and the earth into account. The human walker in the moonlight world accepts the distortions, overlapping, and erasures that dusk and darkness bring about. Thus, this experience is less akin to the pristine involuntary memory than to the habitual memories that cling to sounds, scents, and textures. In addition to the waxing and waning of cyclical nighttime changes in light and shadow, There are aspects of the physical world that are truly lost, like the station boulevard itself. Yet the memory of the boulevard belongs to the sensed world as much or more than to the receptive rememberer. Our passage continues. 4. From gates far apart, dogs awakened by our solitary steps would send forth alternating volleys of barks, such as I still hear at times in the evening, and among which the station boulevard, when the public garden of Cambrai was created on its site, must have come to take refuge. For wherever I find myself, as soon as they begin resounding and replying, I see it again, with its lindens and its pavement lit by the moon. Here we can see that earlier events continue to reside in the body, yet the dog barks are necessary to revive them. The station boulevard, with its shadowed columns and stately lindens, no longer exists in real life. Yet in some way, this avenue has taken refuge among the sounds that are heard, first here, then there, then over there, then resounding again to communicate a specific three-dimensional space. What is the existential status of that place of or in memory? Wherever I find myself, says the narrator, I see it again. At night, perception relies more heavily on senses other than sight, yet the narrator can see the terrain with his mind's eye, supported by what he hears. We recall that in Cambrai there are no dogs that one does not know, and that now, wherever we are, their barks reconstitute a familiar world. We don't orchestrate their sounds, so it is the dogs, like the moonlight as artists, that bring back the milieu that has been altered so thoroughly. Barks are outside ourselves, yet are locatable places that can store experiences. Since a park has come to take the physical place of the station boulevard, the boulevard now resides in the barks, linked by memory and imagination to the small, tired walker who is now also a man, finding himself awake late at night. Five. Suddenly, my father would stop us and ask my mother, "Where are we?" Exhausted from walking but proud of him, she would admit tenderly that she had absolutely no idea. He would shrug his shoulders and laugh. Then, as if he had taken it out of his jacket pocket along with his key, he would show us the little back gate of our own garden, which stood there before us, having come along with the corner of the Rue de Saint-Esprit to wait for us at the end of these unfamiliar streets. My mother would say to him admiringly, "You are astonishing." Suddenly, the predictable walk from Aunt Leonie's through the countryside and home again is dramatic. As a harmonious entity with solitary steps, the family assesses where it is. In the dark, walking as one by feel, by scent, by the sight of ambiguous shadows, the wearied travelers reach this moment of dilemma. The mother has absolutely no idea where she is. Identification with the mother means being lost, repressing what one actually knows, but also affirming what one senses. The world is truly obscure. This is not a cause for anxiety. The father maintains a fine sense of direction and is an able, not to say heroic, guide. Maurice Merleau-Ponty has once observed, quote, "All human relations radiate. They overflow into their surroundings. There is no relationship of just two people. Even the relations between a husband and wife encompass a collection of givens that influence their reciprocal sentiments. These evening walks witness the parents in harmony, even if playing a role like a courtly dance. The child has an imaginative possibility to shift fluidly from one to the other as he is held in radiant proximity to the couple. The coveted kiss is not withheld, as in the terrible bedtimes described in Cambrai 1, when the boy had a circumscribed view from an upstairs window on the natural world and the murmured conversation of adults in the garden below. Here he is sharing in his parents' world, directly connected to the evening, to the ground, to the paths home. The affect between the parents and the walking itself provide a tender way to experience the nighttime world. Later, Marcel must shift his allegiance to the father in order to find a key to the gate in his own pocket, that is, to become a writer. This is opened as a possibility for him, but in the meantime, he experiences the father as magician. Father is astonishing and admirable for his ability to carry whole streets, the gate, and the garden in his pocket. Space shows itself to have pockets, latent regions that are apparent only when a magician has the key. The distinction between lost and found rests on the rhetorical question, where are we? And the act of drawing out the key as if with an answer to this question. As if whole hidden regions of life can be interpreted by our gestures. As if the familiar is the lining of the strange. As if the mysterious, unknown world reciprocally offers its signs to us. And from that moment on, I would not have to take another step. The ground would walk for me through that garden, where for so long now, my actions had ceased to be accompanied by any deliberate attention. Habit had taken me in its arms, and it carried me all the way to my bed like a little child. The corner and the back gate have also gone for a walk, perhaps, and have come to meet young Marcel. It is the ground that walks for him. Habit carries him up to bed. This is a comfort. The child is sensitive to the ways in which the world reveals its responsiveness, unfolds around us, but holds more than what we perceive. That the ground walks for him suggests an alive, motivated nighttime place that is more fundamental than the daytime world, taken as inert material for our habitual operations or for map-making to conquer and civilize. Like a little child is the phrase that ends this section of the book. It is surprising, since the preceding description is of the protagonist actually as a little child. The analogical language of likeness meets perfect coincidence. He is carried like a little child when he is a little child. We readers do not have to ask the question, in what respects is he like a little child? We perhaps would not consider this a happy memory, or we might feel uncomfortable with parents acting as if rigid gender roles fully express their harmony. Yet we would need to move beyond the phenomenological description that brings us to the edge of fairy tale to do a psychological analysis of this episode as a possible screen memory. Each of us has to have some memory that is counted as happy in order to develop resilience in the face of recurring trauma. Readers now get a moment of peace, receptive of wholeness, offered after disturbing experiences of nighttime in Cambrai as distorted and monstrous or paralyzed and still. We are all carried gently up to bed. Let's now examine the sequence of sentences in this passage from Proust. This is only one paragraph. This is a novel that's over 2,000 pages long, so hang on. Notice the rhythm and clustering of the sentences. My numbered sections 1 and 2 include long, leisurely sentences that tell a story in themselves. The first sentence initiates the evening walk. The second is a digression about travel beyond ordinary limits. Narrative pace quickens in section 3 with shorter sentences offering a vivid description of the moon-altered environment and its kinship with fanciful artistic renderings of equally ambiguous places. Section 4 projects forward into the future to reflect on the way that sound carries memories. By 5, we are ready for something to happen. The dramatic suddenly, the danger of being lost, and the magical key held by the father. The last sentence of this part of Swan's Way reveals the consequences of the parents' enactment of the patriarchal ritual. It reads as a slow and dreamy fairy tale ending. Much as Shakespeare's play Midsummer Night's Dream is set in a dark wood that is potentially dangerous but turns out to be an enchanted milieu in which characters find true happiness, these 2 portions, 5 and 6, provide a momentary glimpse of the narrative arc in the whole of Proust's vast novel, In Search of Lost Time. The nighttime walk invites a particular kind of reading. That which is not said is also present. Our past life is still with us and juxtaposes itself in myriad ways to this moment, to this place. When it enters into literature, whether a memoir or novel in which we recognize ourselves, the past is shaped as meaningful. The sheer length of this book, told entirely by night within the frame of insomnia, suspends the daytime tempo and concerns we may have. In this episode, we read nesting stories as spaces within spaces rather than arrayed in an adjacent pattern of a map or sequentially experienced in a purposeful journey. The night walk allows spaces to unfold with pockets of interiors or nests of dwelling within wider places. The shadowy contours and expanses felt through texture or hearing rather than sight open up depths that the rememberer had forgotten, allowing for an analogously nuanced sense of self. Perceptual aspects in construction of the daytime world, built up through directed movement to provide the illusion of chronological and spatial coherence, give way at night to an enchanting aural memorial reconstruction. By moonlight, there is room for discontinuous spaces held within a layered landscape, much like the ways memory and imagination work by association or juxtaposition of the seemingly incongruous. At the end of Swan's Way, Proust remarks, "The places we have known do not belong solely to the world of space in which we situate them for our greater convenience. They were only a thin slice among contiguous impressions that formed our life at that time. And houses, roads, and avenues are as fleeting, alas, as the years." I offer a coda to the analysis of this paragraph based on the alterations of the terrain wrought by the First World War, which, according to the novel, devastated the area around Cambrai and destroyed both the ancient church of Saint-Hilaire and the Station Boulevard. In Paris, the narrator, as a young man, experiences German bombing raids. Let me read parts of 2 passages from the last volume, Finding Time Again, to demonstrate their connections to our paragraph. During the nighttime blackouts, where no light is permitted that might identify targets for the German bombers, the narrator claims that Paris is, quote, mysterious and darker than Cambrai of youth, end quote. And the city surprisingly reminds him of going to visit neighbors in the evening. Roughly 1,600 French edition pages after the passage we have considered, our narrator observes. I'm going to read kind of a long passage, but I'm going to leave parts out. Moreover, since those remembered fragments of landscape borne to me by the changing weather were no longer thwarted by my surroundings, which had become invisible, features of nature previously non-existent in Paris could make one imagine that, climbing down from the train, one had just arrived for a holiday deep in the countryside. For instance, the contrast of light and shadow that lay all around one on moonlit evenings. The moonlight created effects that are normally unknown in the city, even in the middle of winter. Its beams spreading across the snow on the Boulevard Haussmann that there was now nobody to shovel away, just as they might have done on a glacier in the Alps. The outlines of the trees were revealed, sharp and pure against the golden blue snow, with all the delicacy of a Japanese painting or a Raphael background. As shadows, they stretched out over the ground from the very foot of each tree, as one often sees them in the country when the rays of the setting sun flood the meadows, creating reflections of their evenly spaced trees. But by a wonderfully delicate subtlety, the meadow over which these tree shadows, weightless as souls, extended, was a paradisal meadow, not green, but of white, so dazzling, by virtue of the moonlight which shone onto the jade snow, that it might have been woven entirely from the petals of flowering pear trees. Okay, I know, this is going a little overboard, but flowering pear trees. And in the squares, the divinities of the public fountains, holding jets of ice in their hands, looked like statues made of some twofold material, for whose creation the artist had set out to make a pure marriage of bronze and crystal. On rare days such as these, the houses were all completely dark, and then one walked on, and nothing else interrupted the monotonous tramp of one's constitutional in the rustic darkness. This passage evokes the countryside walks around Cambrai, but also Japanese woodblock prints, which were becoming fashionable in Paris, and Raphael's paintings with bluish atmospheric backgrounds hanging in the Louvre. This Paris is not seen anymore, since artificial light changed the nighttime face of the modern city, notably the City of Light. Our adult narrator calls up the city planner Haussmann, so criticized by Baudelaire in the Cygne, for example, for the destruction of medieval Paris. But the widening of the streets here evokes the space of a meadow or Elysian fields, rather than the prerequisite for the automobile and surveillance from on high. Haussmann's demolition of Paris is continued by German bombing attacks, bringing about the fantastical ruins of Robert. When the sounds of approaching airplanes are heard, searchlights are quickly projected toward the sky in order to assist anti-aircraft guns. In an inversion of moonlight, beams of light shoot out from the ground towards the sky and are met by searchlights from the planes focused on imminent targets. Vulnerable and disoriented on his walk, Marcel stops for shelter in a hotel. There he surprisingly has a voyeuristic opportunity to watch male sadomasochistic encounters. Later, he seeks his way home by the light of burning buildings rather than by moonlight. The eerie scene seems one of a piece with the activities hidden indoors. Inside the hotel, off-duty soldiers inflict whippings on patrons for extra cash. Their victims pretend with great effort that the soldiers really mean to be vicious. There is a ritualistic quality to the proceedings, both in the hotel and in the air, and the sadomasochism stands, in my view, as a shadow substitute for war itself. The narrator continues. Some of these Pompeians on whom the sky was already raining fire descended into the passages of the metro, dark as catacombs. They knew that they would not be the only ones there, and darkness enveloping everything like a new element has the effect, irresistibly tempting to some, of suppressing the first stage of pleasure and allowing an immediate access to a realm of caresses which normally we reach only after some time. The immediate response of a body which does not pull away, which presses closer, gives us an idea of the woman or the man whom we are silently addressing as being unprejudiced, dissolute, an idea which adds extra spice to the pleasure of being able to bite straight into the fruit without coveting it with our eyes and without asking permission. Meanwhile, the darkness continues. Plunged into this new element, the men imagine themselves explorers, witnesses of a natural phenomenon like a tidal wave or an eclipse, and enjoying, instead of a carefully prepared sedentary pleasure, that of a chance encounter in the unknown, celebrated to the volcanic rumbling of the bombs, as it were in the bowels of a Pompeian house of ill fame. secret rites in the dark shadows of the catacombs, end quote. The catacombs, place of Christian rituals and burials during times of persecution, now echoes the closet, the site of hidden gender identity during similar repression. Underground spaces, which are indeterminate in size and extent, replace religious rituals with furtive sexual encounters. The praised efficiency of daytime transport by metro is suspended for taboo and random bodily pleasures in a no place of darkness darker than the night above the ground. Yet here one can take shelter from bombs and is more protected than in housing with flimsy blackout window shades in place. The narrator makes no mention of the danger of falling onto the train rails or the fearful disorientation of placelessness. He highlights instead the dislocated body parts that make unexpected contact with others' body parts, resulting in pleasurable and unusual sensations. Underground spaces are not aligned with the surface terrain and may distort both imagination and memory. The darkness as a new element is raw and unattached to habitual or natural motions. How did we end up here? Can we find our way? Why articulate-lived spatiality? We want to understand the obscure country, to see how partial or disjointed views can either contribute to a whole picture of the world in which we inhere or can limit our access to it. The nighttime shifts and distortions of space bring to our attention the breakdown of what is taken for granted and the role, in this case, abstract categories have in our daytime life. The child of Cambrai I, alone and missing his mother, imagines that he will be cast out forever by a judging father for violating the rules of bedtime. The child of Cambrai II feels the father's protection and love of both himself and the mother. Both stories are in some sense true, but the first blocked out the reality of the second, identifying similar blindnesses and hence sources of affliction in ourselves can allow for the possibility of recovery of not only lost time, but lost places. Proust's scrupulous and frank detail in telling stories brings us to the distinction between discovery and creation. In our discovery of the felt sense of things that happen, or that we imagine or remember, and thus incorporate into the present time and place, we are in a Proustian sense creating our own lives. Seemingly discontinuous ruins wrought in this novel by the wartime destruction of Paris and the countryside around Cambrai stand as cluttered evidence of the obscure country of the human self. We constitute ourselves as wholes, as selves, supported by dogs' barks, by river walks, by bombs and bodies beside us in the dark. The layered and overlapping effects that Proust describes of our nighttime spatiality are fundamental to a sense of a coherent, albeit fluid self. They are also the source of the habit life that allows us to sleep, carried up to bed like a little child, or to lie awake all night, living in stories. The early life is our soil. We understand the present only as informed by what we have experienced in the past. Our sense of space and time is fundamentally organized on that ground, which is closest to direct contact with nature, with family, with stories. When we think of ourselves particularly as spatial, we are thinking of ourselves as embodied. Our physical movements through changing yet resonant terrain and the memories held by the body itself can bring out the nuanced depths of our past hidden by trauma or by the brightness of daylight thought. We can, in a way, bind the sliced brioche through the interpretation of bodily experience. If we are affected by or co-constituted by the world we inhabit, then we need to look at the shadowy aspects that are not reducible to daytime clarity. We need to hold ourselves open to the ambiguous, sometimes beautiful, sometimes painful effects of nocturnal experience. We walk through this world based on the life we have apprehended and led, making our way through an obscure country that is our own existence. Thank you.